All right, I think we're about ready to get started. So, welcome everybody to our next event in the Pro People Learning series. We have been really excited to bring this to you all. Basically highlighting all of the different ways that lawyers can get involved in working for actual people, advancing justice, and all of the just many different ways that we can kind of approach this problem. Um, And all of our speakers, including Bradley today, are generally affiliated with PPP in some way, or people we just really admire. And if anyone is interested in getting more involved, either with our work or with what our speakers are doing, always feel free to reach out to us. This is meant to be kind of an ongoing conversation about how lawyers can become part of the solution rather than the part of the problem, as we have often been. So, with that, we can kick this off. I'm really excited to have Bradley Girard with us, Senior Counsel at Democracy Forward. Rather than give a long introduction to all of his many accomplishments, I am going to let Bradley introduce himself. So, Bradley, welcome to the series. And if you could introduce yourself and just let us know what brought you to your current position, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Steve. Just a plug to what Steve had said. If you're not already involved with PPP, you most certainly should. One of the best organizations around, and I think doing super important work and changing the field of law. Um, Bradley Girard, he, him. As Steve said, I'm senior counsel at Democracy Forward. Um, I'm a little bit of a generalist, public interest generalist, mostly appellate and Supreme Court work. My background has involved First Amendment religion stuff, consumer protection, employment discrimination, access to justice is a big one. And just basically, I think for me, the kind of through line through my career, the way that I have thought about it, the narrative to it is I work on behalf of people who are on the losing side of society's power imbalances, and you don't have to look far to see those. And so there's plenty of work to be done, and I'm happy to kind of jump in wherever. I started off doing mostly consumer and employment stuff, some access to justice work. And I kind of fell into doing First Amendment work. It wasn't something that I ever expected to do, but I saw a real intersection between a lot of the issues that were super interesting to me, and religion being a place where, at the time, and unfortunately still the case, the conservative legal movement realized that it could gain a lot of ground, and so was using religion in ways that I thought were, antithetical to the protections for religious freedom in the Constitution, but also um, really harmful in a much broader way. And so I did that for a while. Um, but I joined Democracy Forward recently, largely because it's an organization that focuses on a whole host of things that I think are super interesting, and um, the time is right for it. There's a whole bunch of ways that democracy needs to be protected, and democracy kind of broadly defined. And so we do all sorts of work: reproductive justice, economic justice, labor, First Amendment, good government, a lot of administrative law. And so, being the generalist that I am, I was drawn to a place where I could plug in and find creative ways to move the law forward and to help people. And I've been here for about 3 months, so I came not quite knowing what was ahead of me, but given what the new administration has been saying and planning, and what groups like Heritage have been up to in the last 4 years, it feels like a critical time to be doing this kind of work.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I think one thing that is interesting, and maybe this is part of why your work and interests align so well with PPP is that like you said, being more of like a generalist litigator, the kind of the core of that sounds like is just like, yeah, you're working for people, right? And that's kind of that's a really kind of like North Star for us as well, I think, is just who is underpowered in any given conflict here. And it's almost always an ordinary person, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, the legal profession, even on the progressive side, and this was something that drew me to Democracy Forward, also something that really drew me to get involved with PPP when I did, is that the legal profession tends to abstract away from people. Even, like I said, on the progressive side, it can be a lot of highfalutin ideas, interesting cases. And it's not to say the cases I work on I don't find interesting, but I think it is really critical to remember that, like, the law affects people, it structures their lives, and that's what we have to keep kind of central and keep in mind as we're doing our work.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I wonder, you touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if you can give us like maybe some more in-depth examples of some of the things that Democracy Forward is working on and kind of what that looks like actually in practice and how that's impacting actual people like we were talking about.
Sure. So the organization started in 2017, and really started to as a um, as a force against the first Trump administration and the power that the administration was leveraging to get rid of all sorts of things, especially in the administrative state, that really do affect people's lives. And the organization at first was just suing the administration left and right because um, it was really ruling by fiat, not by following the process of administrative law that makes sure that the administrative state and the agencies are serving the people broadly. And since the organization has grown, and I think in a really thoughtful and smart way, which is, there's still this focus on how do we kind of protect and keep the administrative state doing what it's supposed to do, which is, again, um, the things that kind of help to run people's lives, whatever that might be, whether it's protecting, the civil service, the millions of employees of the government, or labor is a great example, right? Anything that you're thinking about labor, there's stuff going through the National Labor Relations Board. There are regulations. There's a whole administrative machinery in place that needs to be protected and needs to, be it needs to serve its purpose, which is, again, using labor as an example to protect the right to unionize and make that a meaningful right under the law. And so Democracy Forward, kind of sees itself as a pretty nimble kind of gap filling organization. So we don't just have one particular issue that we work on. We do a lot of keeping an eye on what's happening, especially in the conservative legal movement, and thinking about, okay, how is this going to really alter the structure of the way that our government works. In addition, though, there's a fair bit of affirmative litigation in states as well, where you see state actors misusing their power, whether it's to ban books or anything like that. So there's definitely some focus on the states, which is also just a recognition of the difficulty of litigating in federal courts. And then the other thing that I really like about the organization is that there's a whole element to it that is outside of the courtroom. It's building a movement, right? So it's a lot of coalition work. It's a lot of trying to connect people to understand that for far too long, the progressive legal movement has been pretty siloed. Everybody kind of has their issue and stays in their lane. Um, I think that's really bad for a lot of reasons. One being issues are very rarely that clean. If we're going to talk about intersectionality in any meaningful way, then there should be recognition that a lot of these different theories of justice, environmental justice, racial justice, economic justice, reproductive justice, like they're really intertwined. And so we need to be working together. But also, I think a kind of broader point, and this, I think, kind of something that aligns with PPP's work is understanding that um, a broad movement requires organizing people and getting people together and thinking together and building these really kind of people-centered, powerful movements. And so there's a big element of that at Democracy Forward as well, which I really like.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that's so important, and that actually like takes me really nicely into the next question here, which basically like how, considering that you want to be really kind of like people forward in the work that you're doing, how do you decide like which cases can have the greatest impact for the people? And are there ways that you're kind of staying, in contact, like soliciting input from the communities affected by your work and making sure that like they're actually a part of the process?
Yeah, so I mean that's a really good question, and I'll answer it about Democracy Forward, but also just kind of generally as to how I've approached this, because it's tough to decide, what cases have the greatest impact for people. Um, and the calculus changes depending on any given case, but I think there's a host of things that for me have always come into the calculation, which is, some cases you have are just really big questions of law, right? They're maybe clean questions of law. It's going to alter the landscape on whatever subject area you want to fill in the gap with, right? Um, but there are some cases where it doesn't seem like such a huge question of law, at least not at first. Sometimes they develop into one, but where there's just an issue of like manifest injustice. And yeah, maybe the number of people that you're helping is smaller in those cases than some of these big questions of law. But ultimately, it's really worth it because we have a specific set of skills and we can fight for what we think is right. And sometimes that's just the way that it goes. At Democracy Forward, there's just a whole host of experts in how the government works. And so one of the things that we think about a lot, and you can see it from any of our work, is like, okay, this sort of thing, this administrative issue, whether it's particular to an agency or not, might seem like kind of a wonky thing. Um, but we need to understand actually how does this play out, right? What effect does this actually have? Um, and you really need to have an expertise in how government works to understand that, right? And that's something that the organization has built, done just an impeccable job over the years building, so that folks really understand. Yeah, this is how the administrative state works. This is what this rule from Health and Human Services or the EEOC or whatever it might be, this is actually how it's going to play out on the ground. And I think that's a really important thing to be thinking about, right? Always kind of you have to be thinking, yeah, what's the legal question? Is this an open legal question? All that stuff that lawyers generally think about. Um, but what I don't always see that, I think is critical here and something that Democracy Forward does really well is, yeah, thinking like, what does this mean to people, right? Like, how does this actually affect the people who rely on this government service or who will be subjected to this kind of ruling? Um, and in terms of interacting with the communities, it's really important. It's something that a lot of groups don't do. I I think there needs to be a much bigger focus on this from the progressive litigating side, because you can't just be an organization that parachutes in to some community and says, "Oh, well, we know what the answer should be to this legal question." And so there's a lot of just like the hard work of building those connections, of contacting the people who are local, working with local organizers, talking to and building those relationships so that, it becomes a kind of back and forth and a real two-way street so that we know that we are actually working on behalf of them, and on behalf of the issue, and not just kind of coming in and saying, "Oh, well, we know what's best." I think that's the real issue. You hear a lot about, um, people talk about like organizing, and I think that actual organizing, is critical. It's not always done. Can be kind of a buzzword, but it is critical because you need to interact with people. You need to find out how these things, affect communities and what the communities want. And that just takes the kind of, the hard work of getting out there and talking to folks and talking to the groups that are working on the ground and building those relationships. And I think that like having some people who are really dedicated to that as we do it at DF makes all the difference.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I'm always really glad to hear organizations doing that kind of work because it's like it's almost a cliche in organizing spaces at this point, but it's like the people closest to the problem or the people closest to the solution, right? So
Yeah.
it's always good to hear folks like you all are engaging in that. So I think that's really great. Um, so the next question we had is basically like, a lot of times people will see kind of like doing like impact litigation and things like that. It's almost like policy making by a different means and things like that. Like, how do you see like impact litigation and policy advocacy, legislative advocacy, kind of like working together? And to what extent has that been part of your work or your colleagues' work?
Yeah. So, I've talked about this, a lot before, and I have to tell people that like, as an impact litigator, especially an impact litigator, they need to be prepared for me to like talk a bunch, talk poorly about impact litigation and appellate litigation specifically. And it's not because those things aren't important. They are, and I love doing them. It's that I think the legal field, especially starting in law school, focuses on those as the only ways to change, right? You just read in law school, you read appellate opinions. And so everybody in law school has this idea that the only way change happens is through impact litigation at the appellate and Supreme Court level. And that's just not right. I mean, I think it's a terrible theory of change. Impact litigation and, appellate litigation are important parts, of a broader strategy. They're important tools, and I think we need to use them, for sure, especially in a little bit in the current moment. I can talk about that later, but, um, you know, policy, communications, outreach, organizing, these things all need to be done together, right? So people look to something like Brown v. Board and they think, oh, look, it was just this like brilliant litigation strategy. And it's just not true, right? Like behind Brown v. Board was years of really thoughtful, really strategic organizing. It was on the ground organizing. There were boycotts, there were lots of local communities really getting together and doing this work. And of course, the litigation was super important too. Um, but it was not done in a vacuum. And so, you can think about policy in the kind of narrow sense, which is, legislative and also really important, right? Um, if one of my colleagues can get a good bill passed and then I don't have to sue on an issue over and over again, great. That's a wonderful change to the law. But even thinking about it more broadly, it just needs to be thought about as say, okay, well, again, going back to what is it that we're looking for? How do we want to, better people's lives? and what are the ways that all of these various things can kind of come together. So, getting communities on board, getting people organized, getting people to realize that like this is a really important issue and this really matters. You should be paying attention to what's happening in the courts, um, but not exclusively, right? And I think the marriage equality movement is another example where they really understood and did this very well. Impact litigation was a huge part of it, obviously, but they also knew that they needed to change hearts and minds, right? That a lot of people had these prejudices against gay men, especially, and they kind of thought of them as these caricatures. And um, seeing that, like, oh no, this is just like my neighbors. And these are just like two middle-aged guys who love each other and just want to like be able to be married. Um, that sort of thing. It's not a legal question, right? But like that really matters, and people need to be thinking about how do you kind of engage all of these things alongside the litigation, because the courts aren't going to save us.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up I mean those two cases in particular, but like I think so many of like the landmark cases that we think of, like when you think of like what litigation has brought us, and it's like and like you said, these are hugely important cases. There was a lot of really great work that went into them, but this is something that law schools and just the way that the law is covered in general, even just publicly, strips away so much of that context, and you lose all of the groundwork that's laid, for decades before something like that is even possible, if not centuries, like so yeah.
Absolutely. And it sets up law students, I think, to have the wrong mentality,
Mhm.
right? Which is, okay, I just need to go to court and sue, right? And then we can change these things. And I think that's just a mistake.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we didn't prep this one, but I think, pass that anyway, but how is the upcoming change in administration? Has that changed the way that you are kind of like approaching litigation strategy? What kinds of cases you might bring, or like even just like what kind of approach to take to that? Like how are you kind of accounting for that in this I don't know, kind of like uncertain transition right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, it is uncertain, right? And so a lot of it will depend on what the administration does.
Mhm.
Um, but I think, there's kind of two things that are happening and kind of bubbling up, but that will happen under the new administration, which is, look, with the power that the new administration will have, and with what it's clearly laid out as its agenda, there needs to be a real focus on um, building people power and organizing. That's going to be super important. At the same time, there's going to need to be challenges to administrative or the administration's actions, because we saw in the first administration that there were plenty of times to just try to skip over what the law required or just dramatically alter it. And although the courts are, it's a tough landscape for litigating progressive issues, um, there still needs to be this check on the administration. And so, we at Democracy Forward, and I can talk about this a little bit more later, have been running this program, or kind of kicked off this program, Democracy 2025. And it's a response to and preparation for what the administration has already made clear, which is Project 2025, right? They outlined what it is that they're going to do. They've made, the conservative legal movement. I know the administration has, at least on the campaign trail, distanced itself from Project 2025, but that seemed like a strategic decision more than anything. But pin it on the conservative legal movement then. They got together and came up with this very robust plan for all sorts of ways to uh, alter our democracy fundamentally. And so, you know, one way that it's changed, that the new administration has changed our strategy is that um, we know what we know what they want to do. They've told us. And so it's a lot of kind of seeing what that is. And then, through Democracy 2025, going back to some of the things that I talked about as being central to Democracy Forward's work, it was, okay, let's bring together lawyers and organizations from a broad swath of issue areas, people who care about access to justice, consumer rights, labor, immigration, environmental justice. The list goes on and on and on, and bring them together to really coordinate and think about how we can work together to make sure that whatever whatever the administration tries to do, especially out of the Project 2025 playbook, we're ready for. And sometimes the answer might be that, yeah, we have to file a lawsuit and make sure that um, that they stick to what the law requires. And that was something that you saw a lot of success in the first Trump administration, right? Even as the courts shifted, there was still like generally a pretty good, the first Trump administration had a terrible record in the courts when it came to anything administrative because they were just trying to run roughshod over what it is that the law requires and just say, okay, well, we're changing the law. And so, kind of knowing that procedural stuff and thinking about how that's going to play out, I think is kind of central to being prepared for a new administration.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. So I guess you maybe previewed this a little bit, but can you share some of the ways that law students and attorneys are able to get involved in Democracy Forward's efforts and and other efforts that are going on where you're able to kind of like volunteer your time or at least like be involved in some way in kind of some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I would do is go to democracy2025.org and you can sign up. And you don't have to be a lawyer. You can be a law student. You can be a non-lawyer. So you can be a real human, a normal human. Um, and there will be, as things move forward, a lot of ways for folks to get involved, lawyers or not. Um, and so I can't say for certain exactly what will be kind of coming from Democracy 2025 on that front, but I would say there is a place for that. It's on, just go to the website and you can sign up. Um, a little bit more broadly, I would say, especially for law students to think about and kind of hold two different things at the same time, which is, look, if you want to be a litigator, you want to be an impact litigator, um, you've got to you've got to get good at it. You've got to build your skills. You have to really dedicate yourself to the craft. And that can feel tough in moments that feel like everything's on fire. I just want to be able to do something. And it's at those moments that I would say are the times to turn to things that aren't litigation focused, right? And that's where the work of organizing and building community is so important. So, at a you want to get involved at a national level, then Democracy 2025 for sure. Get involved with PPP. But also, I encourage people to get involved at a real local level, right? Because there is this unfortunate thought, and this kind of ties into the view that impact litigation and the courts are what save us. But there is this kind of unfortunate thought that everything that is meaningful to folks, it's like, oh, that's done at such a high level. I can't have anything to do with it. It feels so far away. And I think one way to kind of break out of that is to get involved locally in organizing and finding an issue that motivates you. And there's almost certainly going to be some kind of group doing good work on it local to you that you can go join. And if not, take a cue from the PPP folks and start one. I think that that's super important. So I think kind of balancing both of those things, because we do need lawyers, right? We need good lawyers. We need people who are going to litigate. We need people who are going to be standing by and ready to do the work. Um, but we also need people to not feel like uh, they're falling into total despair or just waiting for the right lawsuit, right? We need people to actually get involved too on the ground.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I really I love the advice. I always love the advice, just like, getting involved locally, things like that. Because I think like, you get to a point where yes, like you can do something, big nationally, like, so the impact litigation that you're doing, like things like that. But I don't know. I know for me, when things are just really up in the air and, like that, like it is now kind of, I think I don't know the way forward, but I know that it starts from like making those connections, building those relationships just locally.
Absolutely.
I think something that you touched on a little bit is just um, that people are surprised by is just like local and state government is really accessible actually. And
And you
I
can make really meaningful change for sure. And like, again, kind of going back to this, like all these things being interrelated, like that does matter, right? Like that makes a difference. We don't have to follow everything that the conservative legal movement has done. Um, but that's one thing that they realized and did well, right? They got involved in local government. It They got involved organizing locally, even when they were also pursuing these larger scale things.
Mhm. All right. So what advice would you have for law students or like early career attorneys who are looking to have an impact in public interest, maybe looking to go down a similar path that you've taken? Like what would you kind of direct them towards?
Yeah, so as I said before, I think that like one thing that's the most important early in your career or as a law student um, is that if you want to have an impact in the public interest, and especially in litigating, you have to be good at it. It's a skill, right? It's not something that you're just born with. It's a learned skill. So I think that generally involves like learning how to be an excellent writer. Behind me is a whole bookshelf of mostly books on writing. Um, that's what we do as litigators, and it's not the only skill. There's other skills, but I think skill building is really important, right? Because having the the right view doesn't really matter if you can't convince the courts of it. And the other thing is, look, the other side, the conservative legal movement, um, I think has pretty much in every sense the wrong views, but they are also very good lawyers, right? Like you have to be prepared to go up against really good lawyers. So that's one thing um, is just building those skills. I think another is, and this is tough in a law school environment, but remembering and really kind of holding on to what it is that motivates you and why you're there, right? The law school environment can really serve to shake you from a commitment to public interest. It's not a mistake. It's not an accident that, you know, people who go into public interest are public interest lawyers and the others are just lawyers, right? So it's like viewed as neutral lawyering or lawyering for good. And that's just one of many instances in which the kind of law school environment, but the legal field more generally, serves to like try to chip away at what it is that people are most motivated by. And it can be hard. It can be hard when, you're in the minority or you see the opportunity for it just an unbelievably large paycheck at a big law firm. But if what you want to do is public interest, then like it's always for me, it was always so helpful to just remember like, okay, what is it that motivates me? And I think then when you can kind of get back to what it is that motivates you, you're also much more open to different opportunities to do that kind of work. Because aside from, the law school environment or early in legal career, kind of pushing people to um, the, the private interest side of things, there's also this focus on prestige, right? And this again is, oh, you have to do impact litigation. You have to do federal appellate impact litigation. Um, and so for me, just as an example, when I was in law school, kind of it was easy to be drawn to wanting to go do fellowships at these big national organizations, focusing on appeals, all of that stuff. Um, but I also, like I applied to a fellowship in Delaware Rural Legal Aid. And that wasn't the thing that jumped out to me at first, but it was because I was able to step back and be like, but wait a second, why am I in law school, right? I'm in law school to help people. And if I can go help people in rural Delaware who have all of these various hardships, and I can go in to do that every day and have that be my job, that's amazing. And so I think, you know, when you commit yourself to a particular principle and you're able to center that, it does allow for so much more to open up, and you see opportunities where it's like, oh, yeah, I could be a legal aid lawyer. I could do public defense. I could do organizing. I could do racial justice or economic justice or whatever it is. Um, and I think that like you find out pretty quickly that there's so much need, and there are so many different ways that you can have a meaningful career in the public interest. And so be open to that, and pursue those various opportunities. And then I guess the last thing I'll say to that is just a point that I've already made a bunch of times, but I think is worth repeating, that as you're focusing on building your skills as a litigator and you're thinking about your career, if litigation is what you want to do, um, also like know that that's kind of a long, slow process. It's a bit of a long game, and that there are ways you can get involved now, right? There are things outside of the courtroom that you can do. You can get involved in groups like PPP and actually um, understand that, like, oh yeah, I can have an impact on the public interest right away by doing this critical work right now.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that point. I think because I don't know, just even there's so much that I think was really great in that response that everyone should kind of take to heart. But I think I know for me, like the most important things that I did in law school were do a fellowship in my local legal aid in housing, which was amazing, and start a PPP chapter, like and for those same reasons, it's like you can even just being in law school, you can start this stuff now. Like you don't have to wait to work your way all the way up. It's not like going into big law or something like that, where it's just like, okay, maybe I'll actually be able to like be first chair in 15 years or something, it's
Right, right.
you can hop right in if you're doing, especially if it's something that's not litigation even. It's like you want to just do maybe some legislative advocacy. Anyone can do it,
Absolutely.
and
No,
you
absolutely. I think that's exactly right. And, I think that's, i- i- as I said before, like, especially important in this moment because law students, and young lawyers, very understandably, feel like, "Phew, there's so much to do, there's so much going on. I want to get at it." And then somebody says, "Okay, yeah, well, it's going to be a few years before you can take a deposition." And they're like, "But wait a second, I want to go file the big lawsuit right now." It's like, yeah, I get it. I get the feeling, right? There's a sense of urgency that people have. And so you do need to kind of balance the two, of the stuff that does take time and building the skills, but also, as you said, like you can go do stuff right now. It's not going to be filing the big lawsuit, but fine. Like go do stuff that will have an impact. That really matters.
so, well, that was all the questions I had, but we do have some from our audience that I'm gonna toss your way. So our first question is thanks for being here. There's so many different issue areas covered by Project 2025. So given that Democracy Forward focuses on many issue areas, how do you prioritize? Like what does that decision-making process look like and who initiates the cases?
Yeah, so I mean, there's no cases right now because it's not a thing yet. But I can talk a little more generally. One thing that I was super impressed with when I started at Democracy Forward, um, was that, for months you'd been hearing about Project 2025. And I'd seen a bunch of press releases about it and all the stuff from all sorts of organizations who were rightly freaked out by it. Um, but at Democracy Forward, we put out the People's Guide to Project 2025, which you can find on our website. And, one of the things that they said was like, look, we read the entire, whatever, 990 pages so that you don't have to. Um, and right away, that made me really happy about coming to an organization like this, because it's like the first step was like a handful of people here, a team of people at Democracy Forward had to sit down with 990 pages from the Heritage Foundation and like actually really comb through it and study it and understand, right? So those folks they became experts in it. They understood, all right, here's all of the various things that are going on here. And if you look at our People's Guide to Project 2025, they um, pulled out some of the stuff that they thought was kind of most pressing, that would affect the greatest number of people, that would be most damaging to especially the communities that are already treated so poorly. And so that's one way, I think, the right way to start. And then, kind of back to Democracy 2025, I think the other thing is, in terms of prioritizing and decision making, this kind of work involves coalitions, right? It involves community building. It involves understanding and engaging with the various groups and communities and people who um, will be affected differently, and understanding how and kind of how pressing some of this is, right? And it's a recognition that as an organization, we can't do all of this. We can't do this. We can't do this alone. And so different organizations are going to have different priorities, for sure. But that's wonderful. That's the beauty of working together, is that no organization has to do it all, and that there should be coordination and thinking about, okay, yeah, who has the biggest investment, and who has the most expertise, and how can they work together and fight whatever it is that's coming down the pike.
Mhm. Yes, thank you for that. Nope, and a quick follow-up to that same question, how do you approach engaging different advocacy groups, like when you're building coalitions, like inviting them to meetings, asking them about their briefs, like what they're working on, like what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, like as a general matter, it's relationship building, and it's something that I've really loved doing over my career, um, and it seems kind of, I don't know, abstract, given the question, like how do you engage these different groups? Um, but the reality of it is that it's actually like pretty easy, because if I'm a nerd about one thing and somebody else is a nerd about another thing, and there's some intersection, like those conversations happen pretty easily. It's just a matter of doing the outreach and starting the conversations and communicating with folks. So sometimes, yes, there's formal meetings. Sometimes it's conversations about briefs. Sometimes it's just like taking the opportunity when the opportunity arises to get into conversations with folks who work in different issue areas, understand what they're working on, what's kind of central to their work, where they're most focused at the moment, and then finding the common areas. And like I said, it's just not that hard once you actually do the sometimes awkward thing of emailing somebody or approaching them at an event and striking up a conversation. But once that happens, I feel like it unfolds pretty easily. And then just depending on what the need is, again, sometimes it's more formal, invite a group, have a meeting with one group, or have a coalition meeting. And sometimes it's a lot more informal. But I think a lot of the informal stuff is what really makes it possible in a lot of instances, but at the very least makes it a lot easier.
That's, no, it makes sense. I got one more question for you from our audience, and that is, what advice do you have for someone who's been an organizer for years and has some policy experience, but is just applying to law school now? You're interested in many things: impact litigation, civil rights, clerking, maybe being a judge down the road, like all these different things potentially in the future. What advice would you have for somebody like that?
So I guess a few things. One, as I said before, the thing that has driven you to go to law school, really work to kind of um, keep that at the center of what it is that you're doing. So, law school I always describe as an echo chamber and a pressure cooker all in one. And so, what you start to see, you mentioned clerking. I clerked twice. I loved it. Very important part of my career. But I very, very frequently will get students who will say, "Hey, I want to clerk. Can you give me some advice?" And the first question I always ask is, "Why do you want to clerk?" And probably 95% of them don't actually have an answer. Many don't even know what clerks actually do. And it's not to blame them, it's that this is the result of the echo chamber pressure cooker, right? Immediately you start hearing in law school, well, you have to clerk, right? You have to, these are things that you have to do. Um, and there's no space to step back and be like, okay, but why? Some people you need to clerk for the sake of your career, right? You're not going to become a law professor if you don't clerk. Um, some people really like clerking. I loved clerking. But like those decisions need to be made and they need to be made thoughtfully. And so I think it's always really important. Some of my kind of most broad advice, but I think some of the most important advice for somebody who's coming into law school is to be intentional. And it is an environment in which it can be very tough to be intentional because there's this echo chamber pressure cooker, right? Something just kind of gets muttered into the ether, and then all of a sudden it's gospel, and then it's like the most important gospel, and then before you know it, you find yourself like doing write on for law review, and you're like, I don't even know why I'm doing this. And so you should be really intentional with everything you're doing. What is it doing for you, right? What goal does it serve? And sometimes the goal is, I find this really interesting. Sometimes the goal is, look, this helps me to build a particular career, whatever it might be, fine, but be intentional about it. And then the last thing for somebody kind of going into law school, or for any law students that might otherwise be listening, there's this weird focus in law schools, this weird pressure to specialize. And so the person who asked this question is already not even in law school, and it's thinking about like, okay, impact litigation, civil rights, like trying to think about my interests in these things. Um, the broader interest that you have, I think the better you are, right? There's again plenty of places where you can do good work, plenty of ways in which to do it. And you should be not only open to those things, you should be excited by them. Um, but the law school pressure kind of is like, oh, well, you need to pick something and that's what you need to go for. You need to specialize. And I talked to 1Ls recently. So 1Ls who are halfway through their first semester and feeling the pressure to specialize, and like, I think I want to go into impact litigation. And the some of them are like, but I don't even know what impact litigation is, but I feel like I have to decide that this is what I want to do. Um, I think that's horrible advice. I think whatever is causing that sort of stuff in law school it does not serve the interests of the law students. I think it's really bad for them. I think, as I said before, you should be focused on building skills. Those are transferable, and then be open to what other kind of ways you might want to go and do good work. So maybe you go to law school and you decide you want to go back to organizing. Cool, right? If that's the path for you. Maybe you don't want to do impact litigation. Maybe you want to go do legal aid work in rural Delaware and just be working on behalf of the people who you get to see and the community you get to engage with. but you've got to be intentional, and you've got to be open to those sorts of things, and the pressure to specialize really helps to kind of knock people off of that. And it just as a practical matter, from when I have done hiring, so I used to be at an organization that did religion law. It's a pretty niche area. Um, and sometimes we'd get people who had a background in religion law, but because there's not that many places that do it, maybe went and did some policy stuff instead of litigation, or clearly from their application materials focused more on the substantive area of law rather than on the skills. And I'd have a comparable applicant who had done racial justice work or economic justice work or whatever at really great organizations where they built their skills, had become these really strong lawyers. I was taking that person 100 out of 100 times because um, those skills are much harder to build. So don't freak out about knowing what it is that you want to do. Um, Build the skills and be open to finding the different things. Again, like I never thought I'd be a First Amendment lawyer, but I found all these places in the First Amendment that I thought were really important, and places where I can make a real big difference. And being open to it allowed me to do it. So that's kind of my law school 101.
Yeah, well, that's great. Thank you. And I don't know, I'm probably biased because I'm in like career number three right now, but yeah, I feel like keeping an open mind, being able to pivot is an important skill. So I think that's really great. That looks like about the time that we have. So I think we'll wrap it here. So Bradley, thank you so much for joining us. I think this was just an amazing talk. I really hope that everyone enjoyed this as much as I did. And I'm just really grateful to have you here.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Thank you, everybody who came. As I said, one final plug, go to democracy2025.org and sign up, get involved with PPP. And thanks for everything that you're doing, Steve, and everything PPP is doing. I look forward to continuing our fight together.
Awesome. Same here. And for everybody else, yeah, as Bradley said, check out Democracy Forward's work, and definitely, check out PPP. Like I said, that was the one of the best decisions I ever made in law school. Drop my email in the chat here if you want to get involved. Feel free to drop me an email. I am one of our main contacts for people looking to start chapters, get involved. So be sure to reach out, and we'll see you all not next month because we're taking the month off for holidays and whatnot, but we'll be back with our next event in the series in January. So thanks again, Bradley. Thank you all for being
Thank
here.
you.